Brilliant, Joel. Thanks very much. I guess for me, like a story is only as good as its ending. I don't know if you think the same. Like you watch Interstellar, you think this is quite good, and then you get to the ending, you're like, oh, never mind. And it just loads like that, where if the ending's a bit flat, it just kind of ruins everything. But if the ending's intriguing, if it's thought-provoking, if it's thoughtful, and actually if it's happy, it kind of makes the whole film worthwhile. Well, we, as a Christian Union, we've been thinking about kind of big issues of life. We've been thinking about the search this week. Kind of, what is the search? What does it mean to search for meaning and happiness and truth and those kinds of things? We've been uncovering in the Christian faith what answers Christianity offers to those kinds of questions. And we've been looking at a biography of Jesus' life called Mark, and really in the evenings especially, we're just unpacking bits and chunks of the biography of Jesus called Mark's Gospel. And it's partly because as a Christian Union, we don't want to hoodwink anyone or anything like that. We just want to lay out very simply what it is that Christians believe, so that people can kind of make decisions for themselves about whether or not it sounds like it could be plausible or not. But it's worth saying that we've got to the end of the story. We've got to Jesus dying yesterday evening, and now we've got to the bit just beyond that, the real ending. For lots of biographies, they end when the guy dies, but not in this one. Because the claim of Christianity is that Jesus, though he was properly dead, rose again from the grave. Now, I know that doesn't happen, which actually is why Christians are excited about it. Not because we think it happens all the time, but because we think it only happened one time. Because there's only been one bloke like Jesus, the God-man, the one who's come from God, who is fully God as well as human being. He's come to show to us what God is like in all of his love and joy and splendor, and to invite us into that. Glad we read that story a little bit just now, and we're going to kind of look at just 4 quick evidences that this story gives in a really brief way. It's quite a brief story as to kind of showing us that Jesus rose from the dead. And then I want to spend a bit longer on 3 reasons to trust Jesus as a result. Kind of 3, it's almost like we're looking at the events in the first half, and then we're going to briefly look at the significance of those events. Well, first of all, let's hit to the 4 evidences. And the first one is this, that Jesus was properly dead. It got very cool a few years ago to kind of say, well, Jesus claimed to have risen from the dead. Maybe he wasn't really dead, but he was. The Romans were very good at killing people, and they killed Jesus properly. He was executed, and lots of his friends saw him die, watched him die as they gathered around him. People in the first half, they kind of took his body. The Romans checked that it was properly dead. Then they handed it over to a friend who embalmed him like a mummy. And you can't spend hours wrapping someone's body up without noticing whether or not they're dead. And then he was placed within a tomb. Jesus was properly dead. Second bit of evidence is that the body was properly missing. In this story, they kind of turn up looking for the body, and they're planning to anoint it, to kind of honor it, I guess you'd say. And instead, they just find that there is an empty tomb. The body is missing. Now, the reality is that nobody who followed Jesus had a motivation to steal the body. We'll think about that in a second. But the people who might have done would have been those who wanted to discredit Jesus. See, Jesus had often said, I'm going to die, I'm going to rise again from the dead, because I'm kind of a big deal. And those who were like, I think he's a liar, might have had a motivation to steal his body if they kind of believed him. But the thing is, as Christianity grew and spread to be a global religion, it would have been very easy to hit the nail on the head and kill off the religion by just producing the body. Look, one of the early church writers said, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, this whole thing is a total waste of time. It's the easiest way to kill Christianity. Even today, if someone found a tomb, found Jesus' actual body in it, and proved that it was Jesus' body, Christianity would collapse. The body is really missing. But no one stepped forward. No one has said, yeah, well, here is the body. It's properly gone. Third bit of evidence that we're kind of invited to consider is that here are these women expecting to find a body. In other words, the disciples of Jesus, the people who followed him, there was no motivation for them to kind of do any silliness and any nonsense with the body. They weren't hiding it. nothing like that. They were grief-stricken. They'd watched this bloke who they loved torn to pieces on the cross, and they went to the tomb in order to pay their respects. They're gutted, they're confused, they're asking themselves questions like, who's going to roll the stone away? What they found, which was this kind of this angelic being and an empty tomb, was the last thing that they expected. It's very easy to die for a lie. Terrorists, I believe, do it all the time. They think that they're doing something noble and sacrificial, and they've believed a lie, and then they die. But it's not easy to die for something that you absolutely know is a lie. And Jesus' disciples, the history tells us that 11 out of 12 of his closest ring died saying, I watched Jesus die, and I've seen him alive again. I promise you it's true. And they died for that truth. These are not people who have something to gain by spreading this stuff. They're people who change from being utterly grief-stricken to suddenly full of courage. And I guess that takes us to the fourth one, which is this. Christianity grew exponentially from this point. If you're going to make up a religion, you wouldn't make up its kind of most important moment like this. For a number of reasons, it just kind of slightly feels like an anticlimax, doesn't it? The angelic being says to these women, go and tell the disciples what has happened. And it just says, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anybody because they were afraid. You almost feel like there's a ... there. And yet anyone who's reading Mark's gospel knew that from that point, a defeated movement on Good Friday exploded into a religion with millions of adherents. People who believe that they've met and know the Jesus who is alive again. Now, you may not go, well, that's not knockdown proof. That's not convincing for me, but I want to kind of bring this whole way of evidence and just make us stop for a second and think and go, look, we may have heard lots of things about Christianity this week. We might have thought plenty of things about the meaning of life and death. And I just want to say, how can you explain these things? There isn't a religion like Christianity that ties itself to a historical event in the same way as Christianity does. Christianity puts these things together, presents them to you, and says, we believe in a historical event. We believe the resurrection of Jesus is not just fairy story, it's not just inspiring, it's not just mythological. We believe it actually happened. That's for the events. What about the significance of the events? Well, I guess I want to pick up on three kind of phrases in this story, which I just think are beautiful and that really mean something for Christians today. First of all, this phrase, don't be afraid. Because Jesus rose from the dead, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid is actually, did you know that's the most common command in the whole Bible? It's the thing people are most told by God. And I think that's just because there's lots of things to be scared about in our society. If we think about it hard enough, we can't walk down the street without facing 1,000 perils. There's 100% death rate. There's disease. There's terrible people in the world. Sometimes we're afraid of being bored, afraid of being unloved, afraid of being insignificant. There's really, if we think about it, there's a lot of things to be afraid of. Which is why one of God's most common phrases that he says to humanity is, don't be afraid. So the Bible teaches that the resurrection of Jesus means that death is not the end. I'm so sorry. I just ran home as fast as my little leg to take me. Ended up back here. I was in the middle of a great sentence. Yeah, sorry, Rob. So imagine, I was talking about how don't be afraid. Jesus says, or the angelic man says, don't be afraid because Jesus is risen from the dead. And, I once heard it explained like this. Imagine if this weekend, just before the England Six Nations match, someone phones you up someone phones you up. Eddie Jones phones you up, the coach of the England team, and says, look, I just need you to play in the fly half position this weekend. Now, for some of you, that would be really surprising because you're not English. Some of you would be very surprising because, as a woman, why would you play for the men's rugby team? But just go with me on it. And imagine that you're going into that match, some of these lads are massive, and you'd be nervous, you'd be terrified, you'd be smashed to bits. But imagine if you knew going into that match that in 18 minutes' time, you'd walk off the pitch in perfect health. You knew it was all going to be fine. You'd be like, this is amazing. I'm indestructible. You would fly into every tackle. You'd smash everyone to bits. You'd take the ball wherever you could. You'd be all over the place. And the resurrection of Jesus is a bit like knowing before the match that everything's going to be okay. It's a lie that Christianity kind of gives you perfect health and perfect happiness in every situation and unbelievable riches and all that kind of stuff. But it's not a lie that Christianity says everything's going to be okay in the end because Jesus rose from the dead. And he promises to do the same to you too. Don't be afraid. You can trust Jesus with your life. Second word that I guess I want to pick up from in that phrase is this: tell the disciples and Peter. I don't know if you missed that in the reading there. Tell the disciples and Peter. Now, that feels like a bit of a, why pick that out? It's a kind of a throwaway line. But in the stories of Mark's gospel, what we just read, Peter was one of Jesus' closest friends. He'd been with him the whole time. He'd eaten alongside him, he'd journeyed alongside him. And the night before Jesus died, Jesus was taken into custody. He was arrested, and Peter swore blind in front of the crowd, I never knew him. I honestly, I swear on my mum's life, he may as well said, I never knew Jesus. And he even calls curses down on Jesus. He's like, nah, screw that guy, I don't know him. And it says there was a moment where he hears the cockerel crowing and the morning has come and he realizes he's just betrayed his best mate. And he must have just felt so gutted. But the last thing he did before Jesus died brutally was let him down. And yet here, when Jesus rises from the dead, what is his priority? Go tell the disciples and my friend Peter that I'm back from the dead. The other Gospels make it really, really clear that when Jesus and Peter met, Jesus just filled with forgiveness for his friend Peter. He's like, look, I know you've got loads of regrets, but it's okay. I've risen from the dead and I forgive you. Christianity teaches that it's the cross where all of our sins and failures and disasters are put on Jesus and they are destroyed. But because of the resurrection, it actually works. And Jesus stood there at the center of history, willing to forgive you and I. But there's nothing that you've done. I don't know you all particularly well, but there's nothing that you could have done that can't be forgiven because Jesus is properly God and he properly died and he properly rose again from the dead. So, and Peter, you can trust Jesus with your regrets. And thirdly, and I think this is really exciting me, at the end, look, the angel says, look, he rose from the dead. He said he was going to do this. Go and meet him in Galilee on the mountain. There he will see him. You'll see him just as he said. Jesus came in teaching people he was going to die and he was going to rise again. And then he actually put his money where his mouth was. But it's hard to know who to trust these days. Lots of people just come out with nonsense all the time, don't they? And, our political leaders are saying stuff that we can't quite trust. And people, you read newspapers or news websites, not exactly sure what to be certain of. Here's someone that you can fully, properly trust, because when he says he's going to do something, he does do it. Here's someone that even when the thing is, I'm going to rise from the dead after I've died, he does it. You can trust Jesus and his words. So don't be afraid. And Peter, just as he said, you can trust him with your life. You can trust him with your regrets. You can trust his words completely. Now, all of these things I've just described are some of the best bits of being a Christian. They're some of the things that when you know the risen Jesus as your actual friend, you can know the peace that comes from that trust. And I guess the Christian Union have done all these kind of events weeks and they've put all this stuff on, partly because they want people just to explore and hear what Christianity has to say, but partly also because ultimately they want to have the confidence to invite people to say, you should think about becoming a Christian too. Ever since I've become a Christian, I've never regretted it because I've got a friend in Jesus who can do all of these things for me. And there's no one quite like him. Great. Why don't I pass over to Elozai?